Yeah, so I'm going to give a brief presentation about CalEnviroScreen, a little bit about, let me just get, a little bit about what it is, since that could take a long time, just going to give a brief overview of it. And what can it tell us about environmental justice in California as it specifically relates to children? And then we kind of just did an example of one of the data layers about the pesticide indicator, about an environmental layer, about how can we use the data to evaluate pesticide exposures in children in California, since we just released the third version of the tool in January of this year. The data is pretty fresh, and we wanted to take a look at what it can start to tell us. So CalEnviroScreen 3.0, just freshly released in January of this year, is a spatial tool. It's a geographic tool of the relative burdens in California communities from pollution and population vulnerability. And it uses a set of indicators, 20 of them, that are combined into a single rank score, so we can compare communities across California based on this information. And it uses a geographic scale of a census tract, which is a relatively fine scale. There's about 8,000 of them in California. So the data that falls into this screening tool fall into several broad categories. We have information, we wanted to look at what's the pollution burden in a community. So we have data to represent what we call our exposures component, which are indicators of potential contact with pollution, so things related to the water we drink, the air we breathe, things there. And then environmental effects are more about the adverse conditions that are caused by pollutants, sort of degraded environment, living proximity to sites that are being cleaned up or degraded, sort of that kind of blight or other stress there. So that's our environmental effects component. And then we have another grouping about a lot of what kind of came up today about these socioeconomic factors that might make communities more vulnerable to pollution. So sensitive populations, about biological traits that could magnify the effect of pollution, things like health conditions are in there. And then the last category are these socioeconomic factors, or I think it was mentioned today, like socioeconomic pollutants was an interesting way to put it, about what are community characteristics that could increase vulnerability to pollution. So in general, without going into too much detail about how the CalEnviroScreen model works, is we look at compare the levels of pollution in communities. And when I talk about communities, I'm talking about census tracts. And then we look at the levels of pollution there, and then we examine, are these communities more vulnerable to pollution by looking at some of the data about health or sensitive populations there, and then identifying which communities have both high pollution and high vulnerability. So that's kind of one of the keys of CalEnviroScreen, is that places we identify as being most impacted have to have both of these things. Kind of stemming from work on cumulative impacts, and CalEPA had this definition of cumulative impacts that sort of guided that model. So here are a list, or actually icons, of the 20 indicators in CalEnviroScreen. So the exposure indicators, we have information on air quality, the drinking water quality in a community, toxic releases, as well as pesticide use, which is going to be the example I give a little later. For environmental effects, this is a lot of site-based data about the presence of different types of hazardous waste or cleanup sites, groundwater contamination, and things of that nature fall into there. Of sensitive populations, this is a lot about health status, so the asthma rate in a community, cardiovascular disease, as well as low birth weight babies. And then the socioeconomic factors, although there are many, and we talked a lot about stress today, so that might be something that we want to think about. But the ones we've selected here are education, housing burden, which is a new one that looks at people that are low income but also pay a lot of their money to rent or housing, so they're kind of multifactorial there, housing burdened. Linguistic isolation, and poverty and unemployment. So how CalEnviroScreen works is, because all these different data sets, they have different underlying distributions, and the raw values come to us in different forms. We put everything into a sort of a ranked approach and give percentile ranks to each of these indicators, is how we sort of compare communities across the state. And then sort of the last sort of to tie up what CalEnviroScreen is how CalEnviroScreen scores are calculated is we sort of look at the combination of the pollution burden indicators and multiplied by the combination of the population characteristic indicators to give an overall CalEnviroScreen score. So we combine all that information in order to compare the census tracts to each other. And we'll see that higher scores sort of mean that this place has greater pollution burdens and population vulnerability. So I put up the results here in our website where you can actually go to an interactive map and to actually search your neighborhood or place you're interested in, look up all of the different factors in there, all the different data sets. And we provide lots of different formats, GIS and Excel, if anyone can sort of access this data. And I think a little bit Rachel this morning talked about how it's being used in some of work related to Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, as well as I think Arsenio is going to talk about how CalEPA is using it a bit. So I won't talk too much about that, but we're really excited about all of that type of work, how the data is being used. So Mark had asked if we could share some information about CalEnviroScreen at this symposium, and also maybe if we could take a look about how it, what does this say about children in California, about are there any disparities with regards to environmental justice. Children themselves aren't included as an indicator in CalEnviroScreen. We previously had information about children and elderly, but we felt that it wasn't a good fit as an indicator because it wasn't giving us the information that we were interested in. It wasn't sort of identifying places that we were concerned about. So it's not included, but it kind of helps us give us this better way to analyze the data that it's actually not included as an indicator, can analyze it a little better. So I'll just start a little bit about talking about what do the CalEnviroScreen scores say about the demographics in California. So I'm going to start a little bit about just what the state and CalEnviroScreen, and then we'll kind of go down to children, and we'll look at children in the state by different racial and ethnic group, and then children and race and poverty, so kind of put it all together. So, as we heard this morning, California's demographics are constantly changing. This data is from the 2010 census, which now is a little out of date, but we've analyzed some of it with the updated data and found similar results. So, moving forward, we might use the most recent data. But California is about 40% white and 38% Latino, so actually almost equal populations, and especially now in 2016, even more equal. So I just put this little infographic so you can see this is what the state looks like. But when we look at what the places that we identify in CalEnviroScreen as the most burdened areas, so I'm just going to refer to those as the highest 10% scoring places in CalEnviroScreen. So if you saw the map, the darkest red color kind of corresponds to that top 10% of places. And what do they look like, these places, compared to the lowest areas that have the lowest cumulative pollution burdens? And you can see that they're actually pretty different, that the most burdened areas have a much higher non-white population, 70% Latino, compared to almost the opposite in the least burdened areas are 72% white. So it starts to beg the question about what sort of, what's guiding these disparities, and what does this say about what can we know about children? Are there actually even greater disparities, or are things getting a little better? So this is just, I'm going to show quite a few graphs, and I hopefully you can follow along a little bit. But this is that same data for this is all of Californians, everyone. Going from the top is the least burden areas, so lowest CalEnviroScreen score, to the bottom, the most burden or highest areas, and then we have the state at the bottom. And in pink are Latinos, and that you can see that, as kind of we saw before, the proportion goes up increasingly with CalEnviroScreen score, while the white proportion decreases. And we can see a little bit as an increase with the yellow, which is African Americans. So we started to look at that, and then saw what does this look like for children? So we got the data on children under 10, and although in the state, so again, top is the lowest CalEnviroScreen scores, least burden to highest. In the state, children under 10 actually make up 52% are Latino, so it's a greater proportion than adults. But even so, we saw that much higher proportion of these most burdened areas were, were children of color, Latinos and African Americans. And another way to look at it also is because, the different racial groups have different proportions of population, like African American children are only 5% of children in California. But what if we looked at what is the proportion of that total group, where do they fall into the state based on CalEnviroScreen? We see here, in yellow are the lowest scoring places, and in red are the highest scoring places. We see this disparity for African Americans, where 20% of the state's African American children live in the highest scoring communities. So that was pretty astonishing for us as well as we saw kind of from that last one. We see that same going on for Latinos. Kind of inverse for white children, and then we don't see as much for Asian and other mixed races. So. Okay, so now we wanted to take a look at, we kind of learned about these disparities that exist for children as it relates to CalEnviroScreen score. We wanted to see how does poverty influence that as well. Poverty has come up a lot today as a strong predictor. And so here we looked at, here we got data on, there's 4 groups. So we have in green, which, actually, sorry, let me go back. Oh, my animation's messed up a little bit, but this lightest color at the far left would be white kids in poverty. So there's actually not that many white kids in poverty in the state. Red is non-white kids in poverty. So 20% of the state's kids are non-white kids in poverty. Yellow, this kind of faint color, sorry, the colors, are white kids that are not in poverty. And then blue are non-white kids, not in poverty. So if you can follow along. The important part, or interesting finding we saw, was that non-white kids in poverty were the highest proportion much higher than statewide for these, the highest CalEnviroScreen most burdened places. So kind of showing that race as well as poverty are playing a role in what are the makeup of the communities that have the most cumulative pollution burdens. So we thought this was pretty interesting and wanted to sort of also use this to do an example of one of the data sets, one of the pollution data sets in CalEnviroScreen, to sort of see how does that play out. And we also wanted to just give a plug or let everybody know we have all this data in CalEnviroScreen. There's multiple data sets. We've put it all together for our uses, but depending on questions people want to ask, all of this information is available for different types of research questions or advocacy. So we wanted to do an example of looking at the pesticide use indicator to sort of tie into some of the talks today related to pesticides. It's pretty interesting. So we, as the goal of the analysis, show how data could be used. So just to let everyone know what the pesticide indicator is, it's pesticide use, which is the pounds of agricultural use pesticide active ingredients per square mile, kind of a handful, but we selected 70 pesticides that fall into this indicator that are hazardous and more volatile, so more likelihood of exposure. And we look at, in that census tract, what are the total pounds of the selected active ingredients per square mile, so we can compare across the state. There's actually only about a third of the state, 2,800 of the 8,000 census tracts actually have pesticide use. And then I should just note a caveat, this is for agricultural production use only, which is the one that's the type of data that's only available at a small geographic scale. So it doesn't include uses like golf courses or home use, so we know we're missing out on some of that here. So that's what the data is. Just another quick sort of coming soon is that we're going to be, plug for our data, I guess, is that we're going to be releasing, thanks to Walker, maps of all of the different 20 indicators, so coming very soon. So you can actually go into all the census tracts and actually take a deeper dive into the indicators, and we're hopefully going to be providing useful information. Like here I'm just showing you an example of clicking on a census tract and actually seeing what are the top 5 pesticides used and the actual pounds in there. So that's coming soon. So I'm just going to have a few slides of a couple more graphs showing how we use the data on pesticide use. So areas that have pesticide use, about a third of the state. And what is the relationship between the pesticide score? So the higher the score would be places that have the most amount of pesticide use. Lower would be places that have very little among places that use pesticides. And how does that break out with different types of socioeconomic and demographic data and children as well? So to start off with, this is everyone, not just children, but we took our data on the socioeconomic group. So remember I mentioned we have these socioeconomic factors, 5 indicators of socioeconomic status. We got housing burden, linguistic isolation, unemployment, poverty, and education, I think. And we broke those down into the highest group, so the most socioeconomically disadvantaged, the people in the middle, and then the least socioeconomically disadvantaged. And we saw that the most socioeconomically disadvantaged had a higher, statistically higher than the other groups, pesticide score compared to people in the middle and the least socioeconomically disadvantaged. And then we wanted to see, okay, what about kids living in these areas with pesticide use? So we have data on the different races and ethnicities about kids in these areas. And again, we saw that sort of similar to some of the information on just the overall CalEnviroScreen, but places with higher pesticide score had were the Latino group had much higher pesticide scores compared to some of the other groups. You know, the Native American population is actually only 10,000 people in this area, so it might not be as meaningful to interpret, but you know, we saw that the median pesticide score for Latino children was 60 compared to 50 for white, and again, they were significantly different from each other. And then the final thing we looked at was, so again, how we looked at children, and then we wanted to look at poverty as well. How does poverty play a role in understanding the type of exposures children in these areas might be exposed to there? So again, we looked at the pesticide score, and we had those 4 groups that I mentioned before. So we have non-white kids in poverty, white kids in poverty, non-white kids not in poverty, and white kids not in poverty. Sorry, but here we saw that the non-white kids that are in poverty had a higher score, median score 62.5, compared to actually white kids in poverty. So here showing that race was playing sort of a role in the types of being in places with higher pesticide score. So again, and they were significantly different from each other. So this was kind of an initial analysis that we did now that we have the 3.0 data, and we actually found it pretty interesting. So I think we'll be thinking about this moving forward, using some of our different data sets and seeing what that tells us. So I guess sort of to wrap this up before we go to Arsenio to talk about work at CalEPA and how the tool is also being used, that we found that race and poverty are important characteristics in determining who makes up the most cumulatively burdened populations in California, and that we see these disproportionate patterns appear to be even higher among children in California. And so just that this analysis can show us that how CalEnviroScreen data can be used for, you know, to ask a specific question like we were wondering about pesticide use in children. So, yeah, so that's all I have for that.